Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is pupil attendance in schools, what governors need to know. My name is Steve Barker.
Steve, your sound quality dipped out a little bit there. You might want to repeat yourself.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. Sorry about that, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, I think my microphone just loosened itself a little bit. Apologies. Very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I'm Steve Barker, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn, who's on the other line. And
good morning, everyone.
Between us, we're here representing Better Governor, and as ever, we're delighted to be partnering with Governors for Schools to deliver this webinar today. An apology that we had to postpone the webinar from a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, it's all down to me. I had COVID, I'm afraid. And in that vein, I know it's bad form to start off with an apology, but if I do cough this morning, please bear with me. I should try not to, but I've got a big bucket of water by my side to actually put my head in if I do, and Linda will jump in and pick up. But this is your webinar, so please, questions, comments at any time would be very welcome. Please use the Q&A facility, and between us, Linda and I will hopefully be able to respond to those for you. If we don't manage to respond to all of them, because we have got quite a large number of people joining us this morning, which is always good to see. If we don't manage to respond to each individually, we will try and group the questions together, of course, but if there are any that we don't manage to get through, we will actually get back to you electronically at the end of the session. So with no more ado, let's kick off. The aims of this morning's session are first and foremost to really put attendance into a little bit of context. We'll clarify why schools need an effective attendance strategy and look at how, from a governance perspective, that should be acting as a guide to both attendance policy, but perhaps equally, if not more important, what we're doing in practice on a day-to-day basis in our schools to promote high levels of attendance. There has been quite a little bit of flutter of DfE guidance in the last 10 days or so, so we will be looking at the ongoing DfE guidance, but we'll also be taking a little bit of a look at some of the new guidance documents that were published last week. And as we try to do in all of our governor webinars, what we're going to do is focus on specific role of governors linked to monitoring and how that actually gives us a satisfactory strategic overview. And I'm sorry, I realise I've just put a typo in that bottom aim there. It should say attendance, of course. There's a rogue B floating in it. Excuse me. So with no more ado, let's actually kick off and think about, first and foremost, why does attendance matter? And nothing on this slide I hope will actually be new to you, but what I've done is actually taken an excerpt, a quote from what's called a blog that was actually taken, or produced rather, I should say, by the Department of Education itself back in February this year. Excuse me. And as I say, there's nothing particularly revolutionary about this, but I think it's important to actually recognise from a governance perspective that old adage that a day lost in school is a day lost forever. No 2 days are ever going to be the same for pupils. And there is that concept that if we're not valuing our children's education, then clearly that's going to have an impact on their future, not just in terms of their academic success, but also in terms of life chances, etc. So there's some keywords in this quote here, as you can see, things like potential. But of course, the backdrop to all of this is when children and young people are in school, we know that they are safe as they can be in our schools. When they're not in school, those safeguarding concerns can be heightened, and obviously there's a far greater risk there. So there is a bit of a double-edged sword here, but of course, what we're primarily concerned about here is ensuring that all schools are encouraging as many pupils as possible to be there for the maximum amount of time. And thought it would be helpful just to share with you a little bit of data. Data, of course, has been in short supply since the pandemic, and we're only just getting into a situation now where data is actually beginning to flow again. And this autumn we will see, excuse me, something of a return to where we were pre-pandemic. But looking at the data, most of this data does actually refer to pre-pandemic results. But of course, I think most of us will probably be in a situation in our schools and in our trusts where we know that attendance probably is a bigger issue now than it has been historically, and certainly generally for the country as a whole, attendance has not got back to pre-pandemic levels at the moment. So what we do know from the data that we had historically is that those children and young people in our schools who were higher attainers at the end of both Key Stage 2, in other words, at the end of junior school, and also at the end of their secondary school, at the end of Key Stage 4, they had lower levels of absenteeism than lower attenders. Now, you might say, well, okay, could be another number of factors in there as well. There are, but actually, generally speaking, there is some pretty compelling evidence to say if you're not in school, you're not learning.
I think the other thing there to note is, although it's not stated explicitly, the disaffection and absence are often very closely aligned. So the more attendance is an issue, the more likely it is that a child is becoming disaffected with education generally and distracted into not wanting to be at school for a whole range of different reasons.
Absolutely, and again, then if we split that down and actually just look at Key Stage 2, so in other words, when children are in between years 3 and year 6, just before they go to secondary school, those children achieving below age-related expectation, which is what ARE is an abbreviation of, those children achieving below age-related expectation in 2019 had absence rates overall as an average of 4.7%, whereas those who were reaching age-related expectation, it was a little bit less at 3.5, and those exceeding, so the most able children, according to those end of Key Stage 2 tests, theirs was right down at 2.7%. So again, further specific guidance from a Key Stage 2, data, sorry, I should say, from a Key Stage 2 perspective. And a similar position in that bottom box there. If we look at Key Stage 4 data, again, going back to 2019, those pupils with 100% attendance at Key Stage 4, 83.7% of them achieved grade 9 to 4. Those are the highest grades. Now, of course, the system changed a couple of years ago. So grade 9 is the best, and grade 1 is the lowest. But 4 to 9, those are considered to be good passes. And again, those youngsters at secondary level who were recorded as persistently absent, in other words, missing more than 10%, their achievement figure in English and maths was only 35% compared to that 83.7. You can see we've got a comment on the Q&A panel from Nick, and Nick saying attendance is only an indicator. The underlying problems that are affecting the child's education there isn't a causal link between attendance and attainment. No, I think you're absolutely right, Nick, and that's not what we're saying here. But there may not be, sorry, causal. It said not causal, didn't it? Sorry, we're not implying a causal relationship. We're absolutely not. But certainly we know anecdotally, and we can see from the results that where we've got youngsters who've got attendance problems, that is having an impact. And I think most of us would hopefully recognise that that's a fairly obvious impact. It may not be a causal one, but it might be. We don't have that empirical evidence to back that up. But clearly what we do know is if children are not in school, they're not learning, whatever the reason there. Okay, so just thinking about why is having an attendance strategy, why is it important that in our trusts, in our schools, as governors, we know what the strategy is specifically for attendance? In other words, what are we trying to do? Where are we going? And I think the first reason for me as to why it's so crucial is that attendance itself is a dynamic process. It's influenced, as that last comment indicated, by a whole variety of different factors. And we will come along and talk about some of those as we go through this session this morning. But the important thing for us to recognise is that historically, I think there has been a tendency, and again, I don't wish to offend anybody by saying this, but in quite a lot of our schools, to look at attendance and to view attendance purely as a data exercise. I think the whole point of this session that Linda and I have put together for you this morning is to actually really hammer home that point, that it's not, the data is the starting point, and actually there is a story behind every child's attendance. And the important thing is that schools actually begin to understand and to unpick what those stories are, so that they can intervene as early as possible and actually do something about it. I can see we've got a comment on the panel at the moment from Ursula. And could you correct what you said about being at home and not learning? It's a generalization, Ursula. I'm not trying to offend anybody. There are some children, young people who, of course, are reasonably effectively home educated. But the problem is, again, we don't know. So generally speaking, we do know from looking at the data, and you can interrogate the data, a lot of those children, young people missing school are not learning because they're not being educated at all. Some are, absolutely, but as a generalization, I think what I said was actually reasonably accurate, and there is plenty of evidence to actually back that up.
And we are talking here about children who are on a school roll. This is part of a school attendance strategy for those pupils who are currently on their school roll, and for whom they are therefore responsible for that effective education.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't lose sight of this. And of course, don't forget what we said in terms of the context. The context is we've had COVID, it's not over yet, as I can personally demonstrate. We've had COVID that had a major impact on school attendance right the way across the country, and in Scotland, England, and Wales as well. And at this point in time, we are not back to pre-pandemic levels. And there is a concern, not just a concern that we should hold as governors, though I absolutely believe that we should, but there's a concern at government level that this isn't good enough. We've got too many children whose vulnerability is being increased because they're not in school at this point in time. So that's the backdrop on everything that we're saying this morning. And because of that, I think it's important that schools do need to have a plan, a strategy in place, which is responsive to any of those issues that might be emerging in terms of individuals, in terms of families, perhaps in terms of small cohorts of children that relate to attendance concerns. And there will be those. And I think historically, as I say, for me, we've tended to look at attendance in absolute terms, and we've not really begun to dig into those numbers in any significant way. And the DfE makes the point that strong attendance, in other words, good positive attendance, you put that together with good behaviour, and that is actually central, it's absolutely essential to the achievement of the vision, upholding the values and the ethos of the school, and maintaining good, effective day-to-day life in our schools. And when we say effective, of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that first and foremost, our schools are there to ensure that children are making progress in their learning. And as I said before, from a safeguarding perspective, if a child's not in school, we're not saying they are unsafe, but what we are saying is, they may not be safe. If they're in school, certainly some of the most vulnerable children, then schools are well placed to actually have a watchful eye for their safeguarding, of course. I can see that Georgina's put a question: how long should a good attendance strategy take to have a significant positive impact? I think if you look at the various pieces of information that the DfE have published on that, and you look at the anecdotal evidence from a number of schools, there are some things which produce short wins, similar to lots of different strategies, and there are others which are slightly more longer term in terms of bringing about a positive impact. So I think it depends what they are, and we'll look at some of those barriers and some of those ways that schools are actually overcoming those barriers as we go through the session, Georgina. So I hope that'll become clearer as we go through the session. Attendance, of course, has been in the news quite a lot recently, primarily because the government has actually been quite active in terms of what it's been saying about it, of course, but also because there is a recognition in the media that this is a bit of a concern at the moment. Attendance levels are lower than they have been for many, many years, and that is something which as a society we should be concerned with, but certainly that's something which as school governors we should be very concerned about. So you've got a guardian here that all of these are been in the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks or so. Guardian on the right-hand side, 1 in 5 pupils in England were persistently absent in the past school year. And again, don't forget, persistently absent means missing 10% or more of their potential school sessions. And then Times Education supplement ran a story about 10 multi-academy trusts lined up to run attendance hubs. And interestingly, that's one of the things that has actually been clarified in the raft of announcements from the DfE last week. Not many of them are in the south of England. Most of them tend to be in the Midlands and the north, but that is something that we might see being extended even further as time goes forward. And then a report published by the Children's Commissioner, which got an awful lot of airtime, BBC Sofa in the Morning on breakfast time and a whole host of other places. The Children's Commissioner published a report specifically coming at it from a safeguarding perspective, but pointing out with the vastly increased numbers of children not in school, but actually that real concern about those persistent absenteeisms, that there were heightened levels of concern about the safeguarding risks that are going to be associated with that. So what should our focus as governors be? Well, as I say, I think historically, and again, I do reiterate, I'm not trying to offend anybody by saying this, but historically, I think attendance in many of our school governing boards has been something that we reported on data. And some of us may nod wisely, some of us may ask the occasional question, but most schools took it as really reporting on what's happened as opposed to treating it as the dynamic factor that it is in our schools and getting underneath that. So it's really important that governors do know the attendance levels in our schools, but actually we know what sits behind that. We know what that actually means. So of course, what we want to do is also be aware of trends over time. Well, how does that compare to this time last year? But current context, perhaps more pertinently, how does that compare to where we were pre-pandemic levels? How do we compare with others? And I think that opportunity to compare our attendance, not just with the national figure, but we can go on to various government benchmarking websites now and look at and compare ourselves with schools that are similar to our own and say, well, you know, what's their attendance like? How does that compare to ours? And we always should be encouraging our schools, our school leaders, to talk to other school leaders. And if a school down the road that's got a very similar catchment, a very similar context to our own, if their attendance levels are significantly lower than ours, what are they doing? Because actually maybe there's something that our schools could actually learn from them. And then, of course, we're beginning to really peel back the onion here. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper than that. If our attendance is causing concerns, what are the underlying reasons behind that? Is it about ill health? Is it about unauthorized absence? Lots of schools last year experienced quite a few lows in attendance over the year because parents were taking term time holidays because holiday companies who'd accepted a cancellation during COVID said that it had to be used by the 30th of June or whatever the date happened to be. And that's something that again, governing bodies are expected by the DfE to be very supportive of their schools in ensuring that there is a strong policy and a very resistant policy to allowing term time holidays. And actually, if parents still go ahead and do them, then to enforce the appropriate measures, which of course ultimately does lead to sanctions and penalty notices being implied. I can see there's a question on the panel from Anna Marie. When you say what are schools doing about partners, I have a question. What about our partners, social care, parents, youth offending teams, etc.? Sometimes less effective. Yeah, I take your point, Anna Marie, but I think obviously we are governors in our schools and we want to work with other agencies. If those outside agencies are not working particularly effectively, then there should be an escalation route open to schools, including us as governors, to get involved. But I think it is for us to ask those questions. If we're not getting the support from local school welfare teams or inclusion teams, whatever it happens to be called in your local authority, then I think it's for governors to ask those questions. So what are we doing about it? have we complained? Have we raised those concerns? Now, we're not always going to get the answers that we want. I'm not suggesting anybody's got a magic wand here, but actually our role as governors is about asking those questions, about bringing that sense of challenge to these various discussions that we have, and if necessary, suggesting that perhaps it might be an opportune moment to actually escalate it.
And I think this is something that very much was part of the school where I'm chair of governors has been recently Ofsteded, and the school leaders were praised for their tenacity in tackling some of these issues with wider partners. But also at a governor level, when some of that frustration obviously is part of the discussion in a meeting, we did suggest that, that we were very happy to support whatever letters or escalation if the voice of the governing body could add any weight to that. So it can be frustrating for school leaders at times when other partners aren't working as hard at the same or at the same level as they are, but to keep on doing what is the right thing and escalating to those line managers and others where support is less than it should be, I think is the only way that you can move that forward.
I think you're absolutely right, Linda. And of course, getting underneath those factors to understand the reasons, of course, then puts us in that position as governors, which is that Linda's just alluded to, where we do know what our schools are doing. So we've got the answer to that so what question, and so what are we doing about it? And as governors, we should be knowledgeable. We should understand the range of strategies, not at an individual level, not an individual child or family level, but generally the sort of things that our schools are doing that hopefully make their own impact in terms of addressing any concerns that we do have about pupil attendance. And of course, that will then enable us to measure the impact that they're having over time. The first piece of DfE guidance I want to actually point out to you is one that was actually published just over a year ago now. Came into effect in September 22, but again, I think from Linda's and my perspective, this is a piece of guidance that probably has not been particularly well shared. It was actually published in May half term last year, and I think there was a lot going on there that meant that perhaps it didn't actually get the same amount of prominence in discussions in staff rooms and in governing board meetings that perhaps it ought to have done. It's a very valuable document to read, I would suggest. It's not particularly difficult to read. It's not a particularly long document, but it does actually make some, in what are in my view, some quite sensible suggestions in terms of what schools should be doing, but also from that perspective, the sort of questions that as governors we should be asking about what schools are doing. So it's coming at attendance, quite as the title implies, working together to improve school attendance. It's looking at that broader perspective about how schools work with those outside agencies that we were just talking about, but it's also talks about the role of governance as well. And it's all about a focus on going right to the basics, looking at the causes, treating those root causes of absence by making sure that we actually understand individual context, etc., and looking to remove some of those barriers that might exist for individual children and families to improving their attendance in school. And the point that's made, I think, quite strongly through the whole document is that collaboration and effective communication between all partners is actually crucial here. And when we say all partners, that includes parents and carers most predominantly, of course, because the people who, certainly for primary school children, or primary age children, I should say, the key determinant there is that their parents and carers are the ones that have the greatest impact on ensuring whether or not they go to school or not. When you get to secondary, the balance of power can sometimes shift more towards the young people themselves. But that idea that there is a partnership here, a partnership between the school and pupils, a partnership between the school and parents, and also that implied partnership with external agencies when, as a last resort, we do need to get them involved. And in terms of what those DfE expectations actually look like, they're spelled out in that document. And I thought it would be helpful this morning just to focus a few moments on what it actually says, what the DfE thinks schools should be doing. And you've got these 6 words, phrases here on the slide in front of you now. And the first one, unsurprisingly, is about, well, what do schools expect? Do they make those expectations clear to everybody, to pupils, to parents, to staff, and to everybody else involved at the most appropriate stage? And the expectation, of course, is an ambitious one, is that all children, all young people should be in school all of the time for every session. And it's about the way in which those expectations are communicated, it's the way in which those expectations are monitored, and it's the way in which those expectations are lived and breathed on a day-to-day basis in our schools. And some of that might be about rewards and sanctions. There will be a whole host of different approaches, but first and foremost, from the DfE's perspective, this is about schools having that really high expectation that's widely communicated. Monitoring, as we've already said, absolutely crucial. Lots of schools have been involved in monitoring attendance for some time. We went through a phase, I think it's fair to say, where up until very recently, schools were looking at, and even when Ofsted come to call in the way that Linda was just describing, Ofsted looked at your overall attendance figure. And generally speaking, if your attendance figure was 96% or thereabouts, that was considered to be acceptable. There's always something more we can do, as Linda said, but actually that was acceptable. Now we've gone back to a system that we had in place perhaps 15, 20 years ago, where the government is actually not producing attendance data anymore, it's producing absence data to highlight the significance of the issue. So what we should be monitoring is things like, well, okay, what are the reasons for children, people being absent? Let's analyze those, but actually, what about those reasons that are authorized and those that are unauthorized?
And I think that relates to a point that Naziba has raised around poor attendance appearing to be accepted by both parents and even the school, and how can we tackle this sort of mindset? And again, with that recent Ofsted inspection in mind, I believe, and although we were praised for our approach to dealing with absence, and again, it is about those that are absent that the focus is on here, and we could quite clearly state how it had been analysed, how the data was collected, what the school was doing about it, who the partners that the school was working with. There was still an expectation that it could be better, still a request that we improve this again. So it's a very important area to understand. So if there is an acceptance, or appears to be an acceptance, that parents, some pupils, and even the school are not doing as much as they could. And again, it is about understanding it won't be the same for every family, every pupil. There will be complex and different reasons. And that is why that tailored support for those families is so important to get it right. Because to improve their attendance, you need to understand what is preventing them, or what is the barrier to them coming into school regularly, on time, consistently. So those good habits, what is in the way of those good habits? So until you understand that, until the school starts to tackle that in its strategy, and this is where governance comes in, why is there an apparent acceptance? What is the data telling us? What analysis has the school done? What is happening? What is working? And if we're not doing enough, if it's not improving, what else can we do, could we do? And this is where some of this guidance can be helpful in saying, here are some things that have worked elsewhere, and here are some things that you should expect to see in your understanding of what a strategy might look like.
And I think we've got another question from Colette on the board at the moment. So, and Colette's asking, where would you expect to see those expectations stated? I think you would expect to see them stated in writing, in things like your school prospectus, in the school aims. But I mean, the kind of things that you would, I would suggest, expect also to hear reiterated on a very frequent basis. I happen to go with my chair of governors hat on to the Key Stage 1 infant school that I'm chair of on Monday night, because it was the welcome open evening for the incoming reception class. And although a lot of those children coming into reception class are not of compulsory school age, the head teacher quite rightly made the point that, and again, I think Linda used the word habit a moment ago, that's really, really significant, that word, because what we want to do is embed the good, positive habits of regular attendance, but also we want to embed the importance of regular attendance because of the impact it does have on learning. And so I think I would expect to see them written down, most certainly in school prospectuses, in the information that goes out to new parents, shared at transition opportunities, but also, as I said, reiterated to children in assemblies on a regular basis, to parents on open days and things like that. And again, parents on those parental consultation evenings, if your child's absence is causing concern, I would be highly, highly surprised if the school isn't going to be reporting back on that, because they absolutely do. Lots of schools will run attendance certificate programs, and there'll be letters that go out telling parents. So again, lots of opportunities to really reiterate what those expectations are and keep hammering them home without being apologist about it, I think I would say.
And they often go hand in hand, that expectations and monitoring. So if certainly where I am, and I've seen it elsewhere, that where expectations dip, so that first point that monitoring says, oh, this child's attendance has dropped, there is a little note that goes home to parents about those expectations, reminding them of the possible consequences of not attending on a regular basis and the impact on their child. So again, these two things go hand in hand. We set a strategy, a policy for attendance as a school and governors. We then make sure we communicate effectively with parents and all of those things that Steve said. And then in our monitoring, if that then from a school point of view, indicates an issue, it should be tackled at the earliest opportunity before the habit of poor attendance becomes established.
Absolutely. And I think that conveniently leads onto that third line here, the listen and understand. And of course, this is very much the informed stage, but this is where that duty of care is really coming across. So many head teachers, senior leaders, etc., on school gates in the morning, probably more so in primary than in secondary, but it's all about schools knowing their pupils. And if there are issues, and again, that keyword emerging issues, if there are issues that look as if they're emerging, nipping those in the bud by having a friendly word, listening rather than judging, listening and trying to understand what the issues are. And there will be a whole myriad of different issues affecting different children and different families, of course. And schools have to help where they can parents through those. And I think that leads on to understanding, then hopefully will lead on to actually facilitating support. And that first level there of support, where it says facilitate support, is about, is there something we can help do through the school? Could we perhaps welcome a child at breakfast club? So there will be some parents who, well, the child's always late, sometimes they don't make it to school because they've got older siblings at a different school, and that causes all kinds of logistical problems. Well, how about you drop them off first with us and we'll actually allow them into the breakfast club? That's the kind of thing that schools do. Suggestions about other people, perhaps, well, could your child come to school with your next door neighbour or somebody that lives 2 houses up the road? Those are the sorts of things that at primary level, schools will actually know about, because they'll know the context of the families, they'll know where they live, they'll know who they live near, etc. And there might be some things that can be done to help. But all of those strategies that schools can actually put in place to facilitate, if we say, local support, that's the early intervention, that's the nip it in the bud part. If that doesn't work, then obviously it needs to get escalated, and that formalized support, really that's the stage at which the local either educational welfare, inclusion teams, whatever they're called in your local authority area, that's where you would then get them involved if attendance gets to that stage where it's beginning to cause a significant issue. And again, here we're talking about those who are at risk of becoming persistently absent. It's not about persistent waiting until it gets to that level. And then, of course, ultimately there is the enforcement stage, which is where if attendance doesn't show any improvement, you then go down that penalty route. And I think Carol put a note on the board about some schools have attendance policies. Yeah, I would say in my experience, the vast majority of schools have an attendance policy. It's not one of those statutory policies, but that's another place where you would perhaps, if you have got one, you'd put it on the policy, or sorry, you'd put it on the website rather, but you would share that policy with parents. You would actually share the expectations in that policy with everybody else as well. Okay, so I just thought I'd say a little, I'm not going to read this whole slide to you, don't worry, but this still comes from the same document. And this is in section 3, where it talks about the expectations of governing bodies and trust boards, and they are exactly the same. Attendance can be an issue in academy trusts in exactly the same way as in maintained schools, so there is no difference in the strategies that are actually being suggested here. And as far as the role of governance is concerned, you can see I've just put that red frame around it now, very much reiterating what we've already said, but understanding attendance, so recognizing the importance that attendance actually plays in our schools, and ensuring that we are promoting positive attendance patterns, and they are very much part of the school's ethos and embedded by those policies that we have in place. Part of our role, of course, as governors is always about compliance with the statutory framework. And there are some statutory expectations around attendance. Of course there are. So we want assurance. We should be seeking assurance from our school leaders that they are doing everything they possibly can to meet those expectations and those statutory duties. Governors can get involved in reviewing the data. I hope governors have always been involved in reviewing the data, but the next part of it, the discussion, the challenging the trends, and helping school leaders focus on improvement, etc. Those are things that perhaps some of us may not have done historically. And therefore, for me, there's probably a real action point there. Holding the mirror up to ourselves and say, well, do we actually discuss what that data really means? Do we actually think about the trends that are implied there? And are we challenging the school? Are we asking questions about, well, what are we doing? What more could we do? Which is a point that Linda made a little bit earlier. And then the last one, ensuring school staff receive adequate training on attendance. I wonder if we all went back to our schools after this session today and asked the question, what training do staff get on attendance? How many of us would actually get a response at all? I think there's a big question there. Well, what do we mean by attendance? What are the sort of things that we would expect them to be trained on? And for me, I think that's actually about saying, do staff understand that when they're spotting patterns of poor attendance, that they are the sort of things that should be reported? Because very often schools are looking at attendance data on a summary basis. They're collating the data and saying, okay, we've got 91% of the kids are in school today. If you've got a teacher who's got a child who routinely every week for the last 6 weeks has missed a Monday and a Friday, that's the sort of thing that we would expect staff to be raising with leadership teams, with head teachers, etc. But actually, if they haven't been trained, will they know to do that? Okay, so let's move on. DfE also puts this this little flow chart, for want of a better description for it, together, which is about the expectations of schools. Again, I'm not going to go through all the detail on this because it's pretty obvious, but I think this, if you like, three-step approach to attendance from a school perspective. The first one being prevention. In other words, we are promoting positive attendance patterns. We're making our expectations clear. We're talking about building good positive habits, etc. That's fundamental. We're then saying, well, okay, where we do have some issues emerging, there is an early intervention modus operandi coming into play here. So we nip those things in the buds. And I'm sorry I keep using that expression, but I think it's very appropriate to use here. And then ultimately, if that doesn't have an impact, we then move on to targeted support. And that could well involve external agencies. It could go beyond those inclusion agencies. It could involve child and adolescent mental health and a whole host of other agencies who, going back to Linda's point a little bit earlier about some young people becoming disengaged with education, that targeted support can bring about re-engagement, particularly of those persistent absent absent pupils. And you might notice at the bottom there, it talks about severely absent. Severely absent is a term that the government has actually coined now to describe those pupils who attend for less than 50% of the time. In other words, their absentee rate is higher than 50. Stephen's asking a question here. Is there a different absence data coming back from MATs compared to local authority schools? That's a really good question, Stephen. I'm afraid I don't know the answer. I don't believe the data is actually collated, certainly on the DFE data that I'm going to share with you in just a few moments. It's for the whole country. It doesn't make any distinction. I think the key from the government's perspective, and my guess is it probably is, there might be some variation between one MAT and another, but my guess is this is attendance data for the average data for the whole country. And we know that there will be some multi-academy trusts that are highly effective. There'll be others that aren't. So a lot of that might be geographically context driven, but no, I've not seen any data that looks at that level at this stage, I must admit. And as I say, on cue, if we look at the latest data, and this is the data that was published last week, it relates to the data that is voluntarily submitted by schools and then collated by the department. Currently, about 90% of schools are actually contributing data here, so it's relatively accurate. And what the government does is publish an updated view every 2 weeks. So there's always a bit of a drag effect because, of course, it takes a while to collate the data. But this data relates to the week commencing the 1st of May 2023. So it is relatively fresh data, as you can see. And the overall absence rate, and this is typical the way the government actually sets it out. This is just a screen grab from the Department for Education website. 7.2% absenteeism overall during that week in the top left-hand box. And then if you drop to the box immediately below that, the same figure for the academic year to date. In other words, from September 2022 through to that week commencing the 1st of May 2023. So relatively high absence rate. When you think pre-pandemic, the average attendance rate in schools was in excess of 96%, as I said. So it's actually dropped by almost between 2.5 and 3 percentage points there. Moving along from left to right, we're then into the authorised absence. In other words, these are absences that the school has said, yes, that's a legitimate reason to not be in school. You're still not here, so you're still absent, but it's been authorised. And that will generally relate to illness or medical or some other appointment. But the growing worry that we have and the growing trend that we've actually seen in our schools in the last couple of years showed a little bit of improvement in the current academic year, but levels of unauthorised absence still on the increase and still relatively high, 3% unauthorised. And those, of course, will be for a myriad of different reasons, sometimes no reason at all, and parents and carers refusing to give reasons. And very often it's these unauthorised absences that then lead on ultimately to penalty notices being issued. And then you can see you've got the same comparators for academic year to date. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading those out to you, but I would just draw your attention to the bottom left-hand box there, which is the persistent absence rate. And what that actually means, as I said right at the beginning, persistent absenteeism means that this particular child, if they're persistently absent, has missed more than 10% of all available registration sessions. So registers are taken twice a day. That's a statutory requirement, in the morning and at the beginning of the afternoon session. If children and young people miss more than 10% of them, they are labelled as being persistently absent. And what this figure says, 22.3%, is that 22.3% of all pupils in all schools in England have missed more than 10% of their lessons. Now, that's a shocking statistic in many ways, because if you think about that, the average child's career, shall we say, for want of a better time in schools, from year R right the way through to year 11, which is the end of the statutory school period, of course. If you miss 10% of all of that, that's equivalent to just under 1.5 years of education missed. Now, I'm sorry, I'll argue with anybody that that is absolutely going to have an impact on outcomes. It really is. So this, for me, is one of the most significant issues that we've actually got to think about how that's actually tackled. And then we've got the headline figures, as they're called, from the Department for Education, which is for the autumn term of last year as a whole. And again, you can see that they are still overall absence rate 7.5 and persistent absenteeism 24.2. So it's improving a little bit, but it's still way, way too high. So if we think about what lies behind the data, of course, from a governance perspective, we have to understand persistent absence. And of course, persistent absence, as Linda said, that's where we need to start scratching beneath the surface. That's where those conversations need to take place. Sorry, excuse me. Illness is still a factor, we do know, and again, I'm just about walking example of it. COVID is still alive and kicking, certainly in the part of the country where I live. A lot of schools have had very high illness absence related rates in the last 6 months or so. Not just COVID, I mean, all of those streptococcus viruses that were out, scarlet fever, etc., back in the autumn term led to some very high illness rates as well. One of the things that we haven't spoken about yet this morning is, of course, anxiety and other mental health concerns. It's not for schools to diagnose mental health conditions, of course it isn't, but it is for them to spot the signs, to signpost, make referrals wherever possible, point people in the right direction. But it's something that schools have to be aware of, and therefore it's something that as governors we should be aware of. I mentioned teachers being aware of children with sort of regular patterns of poor attendance, perhaps linked to weekends, etc. Many of you will be familiar with the Fisher Family Trust. Fisher Family Trust did some research earlier in the year, and they were looking at the incidence of Friday absence, and it's actually quite surprising. If you've got access to Fisher Family Trust data, it's well worth having a look at. But if you haven't, it's worth asking the question, particularly in secondary schools. It's far more prevalent in secondaries than it is in primaries, but even in primary schools, lots of families think it's okay to tag an extra day onto the weekend. And again, as Linda said, that's a bad habit to start. We talk about habits deliberately. The habits of good attendance and good punctual attendance aren't just about schools being difficult, aren't just about schools insisting on the rules. They're habits for life. When our young people ultimately get into hopefully regular employment, you can't have every Friday off just because you don't feel like going in. You can't roll in at 10 o'clock in the morning, unless you're on flexible hours, of course, because there are expectations. Those expectations take on far greater significance. And that's why it's important that all of those habits around attendance and punctuality, as well as everything else that we hope our children will learn in schools with regard to personal development, etc. That's why they're so crucial. But ultimately, of course, this comes down to the valuing of education. And our role as governors is absolutely about, do we have a culture? Do we have values in our schools that mean we do value every day of learning because of the impact that it makes on children, young people's futures? And just
there's a good question. Sorry, there's a good question from Phil, which I think is very relevant at this sort of point. If the governing body wanted to focus upon attendance issues, and I would suggest you should, what is the demarcation line between monitoring and operational? And I think this is often, whatever the subject we're talking about, this is often the issue for governors in knowing how to approach this. And we have talked about strategy, absence strategy, the attendance policy, the data under monitoring. Those are all the avenues which you should be receiving some information in terms of reports. That's part of your agenda issues. That's where you raise this initially about focusing, well, what is our attendance? What did the last head teachers report actually say? Then you can lead into, what are we doing about it? What is the strategy? What is the impact of the work that we are doing? And that then can become a regular part of what you discuss when the next head teachers report comes to you as a governing body. So you can keep that focus going over the whole cycle of a year and see how and what is working and whether you are improving. So you should be having that as a focus. That's the whole point of this webinar, is to help you understand the background behind it and the approach that you might want to take. So really good question. Thank you.
Excuse me, absolutely. And the last point, really, just one for note here. Obviously, we are still, the teacher strikes have not ended yet, but just so you're aware, if there is any strike day, whether it impacts your school or not, that data, because obviously where schools are closing or partially closing, will skew the data totally. So that is completely taken out of the data. That it's not included at all. Okay, and I did mention that there was a flutter of activity from the DfE last week. There were 4 different documents came out, 2 of them relating to data, the data of which I've actually shared with you already, but also these 2 documents, which I think are important, and certainly the first one on the left-hand side, persistent absence for unauthorised other reasons. So, and again, this is coming at it, as you can see from the subtitle here, who is at risk. This is, it's about 30 pages, so it's not the shortest document, but again, it's something that if your schools haven't looked at, it's well worth having a look at, because it does talk about some of the very positive strategies schools can put in place. And then again, another, what the DfE have called a news story, which basically is a press statement that they issued to talk about some of those those attendance hubs rather, that are actually being rolled out across the country, very much in the northern areas at the moment, so not reaching down to anywhere south of Leicester, I don't think it is. And also the fact that the DfE is committed to improving both its collating of data, but also the support it provides for schools in terms of how they tackle poor attendance. So I've put the URLs to those on the penultimate slide, but just so you're aware, that new guidance is actually out there. But particularly the persistent absence guidance, well worth asking the question, as I say, do we know in our school, in our trust, that this is actually out there? Sorry, excuse me. I also wanted to very quickly share with you, there's a document that the government actually produced last year, all about how schools can improve attendance. And one of the pieces of evidence that they quoted in there was a report from Ofsted in terms of some research amongst HMIs, His Majesty's inspectors, those people who actually go in and supervise inspections in schools, talking to them about their views on attendance. So you can see the question that was asked: how often have you heard from leaders, that means school leaders, that the following are contributory factors to higher than normal absences this term? This was autumn term 2022. And I'm not going to go through all of these, of course, but you can see that there's several there relating to COVID. Unsurprisingly, it was still around in the autumn term. It's still around now. I think the 4th one down, or the 2 relating to anxiety, both from a pupil and from a parent perspective, 2 and 3 are important, but also that 5th one down, parents and or pupils getting out of good attendance routines during the pandemic. And I think Linda alluded to that earlier. And I think that's something that as governments we need to perhaps be very mindful of, that there will be, and again, this is, I don't wish to generalize, but a lot of pupils with special needs and disabilities are falling into this category, where anxiety, because of the pandemic, stopped them going to school for a while, and it's difficult now to break out of those habits, those routines, etc. So again, the slide pack is actually going to be sent out to everybody, so you'll be able to look at all of these. But really, I would say, for me, the value of this is to say, okay, these are the kind of things that Ofsted are hearing. Are these being picked up in our school? Sorry, Linda, I think I cut across you there.
Yeah, I think the other thing about habits and parents is important, because some parents' working habits look very different now than they did before the pandemic. And if parents are working from home, it can have a positive or negative effect on their children's absence for a whole variety of reasons. We have seen in our primary school a slight increase in the number of parents who have Friday outings or Monday outings when it's quieter at some of the the nice events that it is to take your children to, because their working habits, they can be more flexible. So again, it is about, I'm not saying that's happening everywhere, but it is important to understand that families' working habits can or have changed, and some of those changed habits, not regularly getting up, going to work in the same way they did before, can also have an impact on the family's habits overall.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself there. Yeah, and I think the only other one I would just perhaps draw your attention to before we move on to the next slide is that one about halfway down where it says head teachers feeling uncertain, stroke unhappy about challenging absence. And I think this is more, if they're happy to tell HMI that, that actually raises a bit of a flag. But when you look at the numbers there, 9% are saying it's in most inspections, but 33%, a further 33% are saying in some inspections. So only 20% just under saying it's never come up. It means 80% have. Now, that's something that from a governance perspective, from a compliance perspective, we should absolutely be challenging. There is no reason why head teachers should not legitimately be challenging poor absence. We should not be tolerant. We should not be understanding. Well, I say we should not be understanding. We should seek to understand so that we can put actions in place, but we should not be accepting, perhaps is a better word than understanding. Okay, so sorry, that slide shouldn't be there. I do apologise. That slipped in without me noticing. I just wanted to drop this this last reference in for you because many of you will be aware last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, of course, and this is a document that was actually published back in February, but linked to those anxiety-related absenteeism. I think schools, again, may not be aware of the existence. The documents that are published by the DFE are many and regular, and sometimes it's possible for some of them to slip under the radar. I fear that this may be one of them. But the thrust of this document is really, I think, quite important, and I think it's important for us to understand as governors that this is part of the context that many of our schools are operating in now, where we've got a scenario where a number of pupils do experience social, emotional, mental health issues. And schools have a role to play in recognising when things are not right, of course. We know that this has actually increased since the pandemic. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But the government's view, quite clearly, is that those high expectations, again, right back to where we started this session this morning, those high expectations about everybody being in school for every day, those should be set for pupils with anxiety concerns as well. Excuse me. And there are ways in which that can be treated. And again, if you've got this as a significant issue in your school, then certainly this is something worth pointing out. Navneet's put a question on the board there saying, what do you do when support is not available? That's a difficult one, of course it is, and it applies to an awful lot of areas. I'm assuming you're meaning specifically support for child and adolescent mental health, etc. Now, we know that there have been some issues around the country in terms of recruiting to sustain these services. My understanding is they're getting better. They may not be perfect, but I think schools can suggest that the school, I don't think schools can refer themselves, but schools can suggest to parents where help might be available. There are a lot of charitable organisations out there. There are a lot of GPs that have access to services, etc. I think it's just a question of asking those questions. Well, where have we tried? Okay, if CAMHS can't do anything, CAMHS being child and adolescent mental health, where else have other people gone? So it's about asking those questions, Navneet, I think. Okay, so just thinking about, excuse me, some of those common barriers that we might find to attendance. And again, this is coming back to what the DFE are saying that their evidence is actually showing at the moment. There are parents of young children, very young children, who don't think attendance is important, and clearly that is a consideration. I mean, Linda talked about Monday and Friday absences just because you can, because work patterns. There are some parents of very young children. When I say young children, I mean potentially those, not just those who aren't of compulsory school age in our reception and nursery classes, but even those at Key Stage 1, where the parents say, well, actually, I'm going shopping tomorrow and it's a nice day, and so I'm I'm going to take little so-and-so with me. And that's really about attitudes, it's about values. So again, as one can accept, that's going to be a bit of a barrier. Some parents, of course, will have had not the best experience of school themselves, and therefore are not particularly minded to value education in the same way that we would want. Sorry, what's happened there? Sorry, I hit a button inadvertently. So again, there is perhaps a parenting issue that needs addressing by the school, or potentially by getting outside agencies involved. But also parents actually not understanding the data. And I'm sorry, this isn't intended to be pejorative in anything, but I think it's actually quite a powerful point to make, that if you tell a parent their child got 90% in a test, that's really good, that's really positive. But for parents to then flip that around and be told that, well, actually 90% attendance is really bad, not being there for 10%. And I think there are instances, we know anecdotally that this does happen, that parents don't actually recognise that importance of the highest possible attendance figures. Yeah, sometimes home routines are such that they are not supportive of regular and punctual attendance in school. Family habits, and that might be about the way in which drop-offs or work commitments are actually prioritised. Sometimes we'll have children who are young carers, of course. There's much more data about that now than we've ever had in the past, which is really helpful. Mental health issues we've talked about, that's becoming a more significant barrier. And of course, something that's pretty pertinent at the moment, and again, this was a feature for us in National School Governors Awareness Day back in February, and I know it's been a real focus for governors for schools in the last 2 weeks. The whole issue about the impact of the cost of living or the economic crisis on some of our most vulnerable families, and therefore on some of our most vulnerable children, that's not going away. You saw the inflation rates quoted on the news. I think it was last night. I saw it this morning. Inflation is still up there, and inflation, of course, disproportionately affects the most economically disadvantaged in our society more than anybody else. That's putting pressures on families' attendance, because things like inability to afford shoes, afford meals, etc. There's a perceived stigma about that, and parents actually want to avoid that. The easiest way to avoid it is to not send your child to school. Now, the document that I referenced a few moments ago that talked about the including the Ofsted report in it is this document that's actually on the little postage stamp screen at the moment, this securing good attendance and tackling persistent absence. And again, this is a really helpful document, I think, to ask if your schools have actually seen in the past, because this talks about some of the strategies that schools are reporting are most effective in tackling some of those barriers to attendance that exist in our school communities. We've talked about listening. We've talked about the idea that, getting that dialogue going so that we're developing an understanding of, well, what are the real issues affecting you as a parent or carer which actually prevent you sending your child to school? Listening to the children and young people themselves, because very often they will say things that perhaps parents won't, that give us a really valuable insight into what's happening. Lots of schools reported that having the right people to have conversations with parents. Now, with the greatest respect to classroom teachers, my wife is a classroom teacher, but I know how busy it is at the start of the day. A classroom teacher is not best placed probably to have those detailed conversations. So if there is somebody, secondary schools very often have attendance officers who will have those conversations. Primary schools don't have that very often, the number of staff to do that, but there may well be there's somebody in the office who from time to time can be on the school gate in the morning and can try and catch parents if they think they need to, or be there so that parents know that there is someone to talk to. High ambition, we talked about right at the very beginning. The role of governance. Governors can play, obviously, that strategic role in terms of ensuring that the vision and ethos of the school are tied up in that forming good habits about attendance, being there every day and valuing education for its own right, etc. But I think there's also a role to play in some schools for attendance to be championed by governors through perhaps joining head teachers sometimes for attendance conversations with specific groups of parents, for actually being there at consultation evenings, etc. But also asking those what are quite challenging questions. Well, why aren't we following through? Why aren't we going to that enforcement stage? Because actually one of the things that the government is saying at the moment, and there is rumour that they're actually going to perhaps change the regulations on this later in the year, is that schools and authorities are not using enforcement. In other words, they're not issuing penalty notices as much as the government actually thinks they ought to be. And then last but by no means least, of course, is that idea that as governors, reflection should always be part of what we do. So that holding the mirror up and say, well, let's look at our school practices. Let's look at how successful we are in perhaps recognizing some of those barriers and then trying to do something about addressing the weaknesses that are inherent in those. And very often, I think we need to, as governors, actually ask that question, what more could we do? And sometimes what more we could do is actually say, well, okay, this hasn't worked. Let's look beyond our school at the sort of things that other people have done and see if there's any scope for us there. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, I think 4 key points to make from our perspective. Firstly, remember, attendance isn't just about data. It's actually about getting under that data. And getting under that data, a really good start point for us is actually for governors to actually know their school's context and to recognise, of course, that context changes over time. We just talked about the economic situation. That's having a big impact without any doubt whatsoever. Know how our schools are tackling improving attendance. Hopefully it is improving, but if it's not, what are they doing to try and improve it? And as I said a few moments ago, always ask, what more could we do? I'm aware that we have probably run a minute or so over. I do apologise for that, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that's in part down to the number of questions that we've had. Thank you very much for all the questions we've had. Those that we haven't directly answered, we will go through and we will get back to you after the event. But all that remains for us to say is that those are the references there. As I said, the handout's going to be sent to you. They're the references for all the documents that we've made reference to as we've gone through the session this morning. Sorry, that's very bad English, isn't it? But all that remains for Linda and I to say is thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody.